The Man Who Wore 1,000 Faces. Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Mirror. Elliot never remembered waking up the same way twice. Some mornings his face bore freckles that hadn't been there the day before. Other mornings his jawline seemed narrower, his nose slightly off, his reflection blinking just a half second too late, as if it had to catch up. For most people, the mirror offered familiarity. For Elliot, it offered mystery. He lived alone in a tall, creaky house at the edge of town, passed down by a grandfather no one else remembered. It was filled with mirrors, long ones, round ones, mirrors cracked down the center and those trimmed with gold leaf. They weren't decorations. They were necessities. Every day, Elliot studied himself. He checked every reflection, not just to shave or fix his hair, but to see, to catch something out of place. Because Elliot knew deep down, something about him wasn't right. He couldn't recall his childhood, not clearly. Names, faces, voices, they all drifted like fog. People recognized him, but with unease. "Didn't you used to work at the florist?" someone asked once. Another swore he had been their school teacher. None of them agreed on who he was. One evening, after a particularly strange day when his reflection showed a scar he didn't have, Elliot stood in front of the hallway mirror and whispered, "Who are you?" His reflection smiled. Elliot did not. He stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. The air felt electric, the room dimmed. Then, like a breeze through a cracked window, a whisper answered. "Someone you used to be." That night, Elliot didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the floor surrounded by old photos, every one different. A man with brown eyes, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, a child with a crooked grin. All of them were him, or at least they wore his face. Chapter 2. Portraits in the Attic. The attic was the one place in the house Elliot rarely went. The floorboards groaned louder there, and the dust didn't seem to settle. It floated in thick swirls, disturbed by the slightest breath. But after the incident in the hallway mirror, he couldn't ignore the attic's pull any longer. He climbed the narrow staircase with a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. The attic door stuck at first, like it hadn't been opened in years. When it finally gave way, it released a rush of cold, stale air that smelled faintly of varnish and something older, like memory turned moldy. The space was cluttered. Boxes stacked high, furniture covered in yellowed sheets and frames, hundreds of them, leaned against the far wall. Most were portraits. He moved closer, wiping dust from the nearest frame. A man in a three-piece suit stared back at him. Elliot's stomach dropped. It was him, or at least his eyes. His bone structure, but older, different. One by one he examined the portraits. A nurse, a soldier, a woman in a velvet dress, a child with a missing front tooth. Dozens, hundreds of faces, each one uniquely dressed from different eras, captured in oil paint or sepia ink. Yet every single one carried his features. Some were signed, others bore only initials, but all of them had a small hand-carved symbol at the corner, an eye with 3 lashes. In the center of the attic stood a large, oval portrait draped in black cloth. It was the only one mounted on an easel. Elliot hesitated, heart pounding, before pulling the cloth away. The face staring back at him was painted with exquisite detail. Every wrinkle, every shadow, it was an older man, solemn and severe. But as Elliot studied it, he realized something horrifying. The eyes in the painting moved. Just lightly, just enough. Elliot stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. In the brief darkness, something whispered. The faces remember, do you? And then, silence. Except for the sound of one portrait frame slowly falling to the floor behind him. Chapter 3. The Mask Maker's Legacy. The next morning, Elliot returned to the attic, this time with a notebook, gloves, and a sharpened sense of purpose. The portraits haunted him, especially the one with the moving eyes. He had to know where they came from, who painted them, and why every face was his. Digging through old trunks beneath the stacks of frames, he found a wooden box etched with the same eye symbol, the one with 3 lashes. Inside, wrapped in brittle parchment, was a journal. The name on the first page was Elias Grange. His grandfather. The entries were written in elegant cursive, fading in places but still legible. Elliot sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and read for hours. The story that unfolded wasn't one of a simple artist, but of a mask maker. Elias had traveled the world creating masks not just for theater or fashion, but for transformation. He believed faces could hold memory, that wearing one could allow someone to become another. Each mask Elias made carried a piece of someone's truth. Pain, joy, betrayal, and sometimes, if the wearer had the right blood, the mask didn't just hide, it changed them. Elliot's hands trembled. The journal detailed experiments, masks made from canvas, clay, even carved wood, imbued with essence. He flipped to the back where several small drawings depicted faces, all variations of his own. There were notes beneath them. Subject 47, strong emotional recall. Subject 63, partial regression. Subject 81, began to resist. In the final entry, Elias wrote, "I cannot control the legacy. The faces speak. They are no longer mine to command. He will inherit them. He must remember who he is before they do." A creak echoed behind Elliot. He spun around. A mask had fallen from one of the top shelves. It rolled to a stop at his feet. It looked exactly like him, except it was smiling. Chapter 4. Eyes that changed colors. Elliot barely slept that night. The smiling mask haunted his dreams, sometimes floating, sometimes worn by a version of himself that walked backwards, whispered in unfamiliar languages, or stared blankly at him with empty eyes. By morning, he avoided the attic. He stood before the mirror in his bedroom, inspecting himself closely. That's when he noticed it. His eyes, they were green, but yesterday they had been hazel. He leaned in closer, blinking repeatedly, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light. He turned his head, stared into another mirror, still green, bright, sharp, almost unnatural. The change wasn't subtle. Elliot flipped through old ID cards and photographs, all hazel, every one of them. But now, in every mirror in the house, The same green eyes stared back, the same intensity. He left the house in a rush, heading into town to find someone who knew him well, or at least thought they did. At the corner cafe, the barista paused when he walked in. "Did you do something with your eyes?" she asked casually, like commenting on a haircut. "Well," he asked, "do they look different?" She squinted at him. "I thought they were brown? Maybe I'm wrong." He asked others. An old neighbor blinked and said, "Weren't they blue once?" No one could agree. No one remembered clearly. At the library, he dug through public records, school photos, newspaper clippings, old yearbooks. In every image, Elliot looked slightly different, sometimes thinner, sometimes broader. The faces were his, yet not. Even stranger, some images showed a different name under the same face. He found one photo taken in 1983 labeled Ellison Grant. The man in the photo looked exactly like Elliot today. But Elliot wasn't born until 1991. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the table. The eyes in the photo were green, and they were watching him now. From behind glass, from across time, changing again. Chapter 5, The Town That Forgot His Name. Elliot had walked these streets his entire life, or so he believed. He knew every storefront, every crooked lamppost, and every cobbled path that curved through the historic downtown. But as he wandered through town that morning, something felt off. People didn't greet him, not with the cautious smiles or vague nods he'd come to expect, but with complete and utter unfamiliarity, as if they'd never seen him before. He stopped at the post office where he'd collected mail for years. The clerk, a man he'd spoken to countless times, tilted his head. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Elliot said. "I'm picking up mail, box 113. The man squinted. "Name?" "Elliot Grange." The clerk flipped through a logbook, brows furrowing. "There's no box registered under that name. You sure you're in the right place?" "I come here every week," Elliot said, more to himself than the clerk. "You've handed me letters before." The man shrugged. "Never seen you before in my life." Elliot left quickly. At the grocery store, it was the same. At the bank, the teller asked for ID and then double-checked it with suspicion. Even the librarian who'd helped him find old records just the day before claimed she didn't recognize him. With each interaction, Elliot felt himself unraveling. Was it a prank, a town-wide joke, or had something shifted subtly, silently, erasing him while leaving everything else untouched? He wandered to the edge of town, past the church and into the small, unkempt cemetery behind it. The headstones were old, cracked, and leaning. One caught his eye, his last name etched in fading stone, Elias Grange. His grandfather, born 1876, died 1953. And next to it a smaller stone. No flowers, no offerings, no first name, just a carved symbol. The eye with 3 lashes. No date, no name, just blank space. Elliot stared at the headstone, feeling the chill spread through him, because he had the unshakable feeling it was waiting for his name. Chapter 6, The Disappearance of Identity. Elliot woke up to find his name missing. Not in the literal sense, his memories of it were still intact, but something fundamental had shifted. His phone displayed a contact list filled with names he didn't recognize. His social media accounts were gone, his bank cards no longer worked. When he tried logging into his email, the account returned an error. User not found. At first, he thought it was a systems error, a glitch. But as he wandered through town that day, the realization deepened. Elliot Grange, as a person, no longer existed in any system. He'd been erased. Panic set in. He rushed back home and tore through the house for anything that could ground him. Birth certificates, tax documents, school records. He found nothing. The mirror in the hall watched him. His reflection blinked slowly, patiently, as if it already knew. Desperate, Elliot dialed the number of a friend, Tom, someone he'd gone to college with. When Tom picked up, Elliot nearly cried with relief. "Tom, it's me, Elliot." A pause. "I'm sorry," Tom said. "Who is this?" "Elliot Grange. We lived together. Sophomore year." There was a long silence, then a dial tone. Elliot dropped the phone. It wasn't just that people didn't recognize him. It was as if the very record of his existence had been deleted. That night, he stood in the bathroom mirror, gripping the edges of the sink. "Who am I?" he whispered. His reflection didn't respond this time. Instead, its eyes changed. Not in color, but in age. The face in the mirror began to shift, wrinkles deepening, hairline receding. In seconds, Elliot was staring at a man decades older than himself. The man in the mirror smiled gently. "You're almost ready," he said, and then the face vanished, leaving Elliot once again staring at someone he wasn't sure he had ever been. Chapter 7. The Gallery of Shadows. Elliot hadn't planned to return to the attic. Not after everything he'd learned. Not after what the mirror had shown him, but the feeling of being watched, of something shifting within him, refused to let go. The attic called to him again, not with curiosity this time, but with inevitability. He climbed the stairs late at night, flashlight in hand, though he barely needed it. The hallway was already glowing faintly. The attic door creaked open on its own. Inside, the portraits had moved. They were no longer stacked. They lined the walls in neat rows, all upright, all facing the center of the room. Each one was lit by a single hanging bulb that buzzed softly, casting long, trembling shadows across the floor. In the center stood a new addition, a large mirror on a wooden stand rimmed with brass. Elliot stepped closer. This mirror didn't show his reflection. It showed all of them. Every face he had ever worn. They flickered like a slide projector, one after another. The nurse, the soldier, the child, the woman in the velvet dress. Some he recognized from dreams. Others were strangers. Each one blinked slowly. Some mouthed words. Some wept. A whisper filled the room. Not one voice, but hundreds overlapping. "We remember, do you?" Elliot reached out to touch the glass and the surface rippled like water. His fingers passed through. Cold. Electric. And then he was in the gallery, not just standing before it. He walked between the portraits, each one reacting to his presence. Some leaned closer, some turned away. A few seemed to age or regress as he passed. At the far end of the gallery stood a blank canvas. Paint hovered in the air beside it. Without thinking, Elliot reached for the brush. The moment he touched it, his hand moved on its own. Brushstrokes danced across the surface. Eyes, a mouth, a jawline. When it was done, he staggered back. He had painted himself, or rather, who he was becoming. And behind him, every portrait whispered in unison, "One face left." Chapter 8. Truth Behind the Smile. Elliot woke up on the floor of the attic. The canvas painting of his evolving face loomed in the corner, still wet. Around him the portraits buzzed faintly, as if the silence had grown restless. He sat up slowly, heart pounding, as the memories of the gallery returned. The whisper, "One face left." He stumbled down the stairs into the kitchen, hoping for a moment of normalcy, but something was wrong. All the mirrors in the house had changed. Each one now showed a different version of him. One wore a police uniform, another had deep scars across his cheek. One wore a child's raincoat, hair still damp from invisible rain. They all stared at him. Some smiled, but not his smile. He ran to the mirror in the foyer, the only one he trusted. There his reflection looked hollow, familiar yet void of warmth. Then the reflection raised its hand before he could, and it smiled. The same smile as the mask in the attic. He stepped back. That smile had followed him in dreams. It was older than his memories. It had been passed down, like the mask, like the house. He went back upstairs and retrieved the mask that looked like him. As he held it up, a soft whisper filled the room. Truth lies not in the face you wear, but in the one you refuse to accept. Hands trembling, Elliot brought the mask closer. He didn't put it on. Instead, he stared into its eyes, two empty voids that somehow still watched him. Suddenly, the attic spun. The walls fell away. He stood in an endless hall of mirrors, each one reflecting a different life, a different face. But in every mirror, the smile remained. Same curve, same calm, same lie. And in that moment, Elliot understood. The smile had never belonged to him. It belonged to the faces, and they were waiting for him to claim it or be consumed by it. Chapter 9. A Face in Every Frame. The attic door stayed open now. Elliot could feel the portraits watching him from above, even as he sat at the dining room table, trying to eat. He couldn't focus. The ticking of the wall clock felt louder. The shadows stretched further. And then he noticed something new, something impossible. Every framed photo in the house had changed. There had never been many to begin with, but now they lined the walls. Frames he hadn't hung, faces he didn't know. Or rather, faces that were him, just in different versions. In one, he stood on a pier, weathered and gray, holding a fishing net. In another, he wore a wedding tuxedo, smiling at someone just out of frame. In yet another, he was a child again, sitting alone on a carousel. He walked room to room. Each frame contained a life he couldn't remember living, but something in his bones told him they were real. And then he reached the hallway. There, lining both walls, were photographs he hadn't seen before, hundreds of them, stretching from ceiling to floor. He stared at them, moving slowly past, his face in every one slightly different each time. A boy, a monk, a man in a military uniform, a teacher, a prisoner, a beggar, a king. Each frame bore the same carved symbol, the eye with 3 lashes. As he reached the end of the hall, the last photo made him freeze. It was blank. A mirror sat in the center of the frame instead of a picture. Elliot stared into it, but this time the reflection did not match the face he wore now. It was older, wiser, and behind the reflection, standing just behind his shoulder, was Elias Grange, his grandfather. The man leaned in, whispering in Elliot's ear, "You've worn them all, Elliot, but only one is truly yours." And in that moment, Elliot realized he wasn't just remembering, he was being remembered. Chapter 10. The voice that wasn't his. The morning light slanted through the curtains, casting long rectangles across the floor. Elliot sat motionless at the edge of his bed, a coffee cup cooling in his hands. Something had changed again, but this time it wasn't his face. It was his voice. He realized it first while humming an old tune. The notes came out too deep, too smooth, like someone else was humming inside him. When he answered a call later that day from an unknown number, the voice that said hello didn't sound like his own. It was unfamiliar, mature, measured. He froze. "Elliot?" the caller asked. "Yes," he replied, but it came out strange again. The line went silent, then clicked off. He tested it, recorded himself on his phone, played it back, listened. Not him. Not the voice he had grown up with, the one he'd heard in old voicemails and family videos. It was deeper, older, and filled with something else, like echoes of lives not his own. He rushed to the attic. The portraits were humming. Yes, humming. Not loud, not even musical, but there was a resonance in the air, as if all those painted mouths were murmuring beneath layers of canvas. He stood in the center and spoke. "Who am I?" The voice that answered wasn't from within the room. It was from within him. "You are the echo," it said, "the voice of those who came before." He clutched at his throat. The voice continued, "You have been many, and soon you will speak for us all." In a panic, Elliot ran to the hallway mirror, the one that had always shown him truth, but now it showed him speaking, while his real lips didn't move. He backed away slowly. Not just his reflection, his voice had become something else, and he feared that if he kept speaking, he would never hear himself again. Chapter 11. The Room of Forgotten Names. The attic had changed again. What was once cluttered with forgotten relics and leaning portraits now held a single hallway, one Elliot had never seen before. It extended beyond the space of the house, too long, too wide, as if the attic had stretched to meet the past. The walls were stone, damp and breathing. At the end of the hallway stood a door. Carved into it was the familiar symbol, the eye with 3 lashes. Beneath it, in crude letters, read, "Enter only if you are ready to know." He stepped through. Inside was a circular room, dimly lit by candles that had no wax and gave off no heat. Along the walls, floor to ceiling, were names. Handwritten, carved, scrawled, painted. Every surface held a name. Most were foreign to him, but some sparked brief flickers of memory. He walked along the perimeter. Alaric, Maeve, Tomlin, Elira. Names from places he had never been, in languages he didn't speak, yet something deep inside recognized every one. Each name glowed faintly as he passed. Then he found them. His names. Not one, dozens of his names. Different lives, different times. Each etched beneath a version of his own face, drawn crudely or painted delicately. And beside each one a single candle flickered. All but one. The final candle sat in front of a blank wall. No name, no face. Elliot reached out and touched the stone. It was cold at first, then warm, then burning. Visions flooded his mind, being born in different centuries, in different bodies, always bearing the same burden. A man in Rome, a girl in Morocco, a monk in the Himalayas, a scientist in Warsaw, the same soul, the same eyes. And in every life, a choice, to forget or to remember. Elliot pulled his hand away, breath ragged. The flame before the blank wall now burned tall and blue. He didn't need the name carved anymore. He was the name, and the room once silent whispered back, "Welcome home." Chapter 12, Unmasking the Past. Elliot descended from the room of forgotten names with his mind racing and his chest tight. The candles, the names, the images burned into his memory. He now knew the truth of what he was, or at least part of it. But knowledge wasn't enough. Not yet. The final answers lay deeper still, buried beneath the weight of masks and memory. He returned to the attic, now less a room and more a living labyrinth. The walls pulsed faintly with warmth. Every portrait turned slightly as he passed, as if watching, waiting. In the very center of the space stood a wooden pedestal, and on it, the mask. The smiling one. He stepped closer. The mask looked the same, his face frozen in time, grinning with a knowing calm. But now, Elliot saw something else behind the smile. He reached out and touched it, and the world fell away. He was standing in a desert, then a crowded street, then a burning temple. The scenes shifted like pages in a photo album, too quickly turned. In every place, he saw himself, or someone who looked like him. Different bodies, different voices, but always the same eyes, always the same burden, and always a mask. Some wore it to hide, others to protect, a few to deceive, but all of them paid a price. A voice echoed through the shifting memories. Elias, his grandfather. You cannot carry all the faces, Elliot. You must choose, or be chosen. The vision stopped. He stood now in a hall of mirrors, each one showing a past life. One mirror was blank, waiting. He looked down. The mask was in his hands. He turned it over. Inside, a name had been etched, not his current one, not any he remembered. Just a single word. Origin. Tears welled in his eyes. The past wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a weight to carry, and it was time to face it, unmasked. Chapter 13. The Final Reflection. Elliot stood in front of the hallway mirror, the very one where it all began. The mask still in his hands, the word origin etched deep inside. The mirror, once a window of observation, had become a doorway. He saw not just his reflection, but a swirling shimmer within it, like the surface of water disturbed by wind. His face stared back at him, tired and torn between too many truths. The house was silent, but his mind echoed with voices, his own and those of 1,000 lives before. They didn't shout. They waited. He raised the mask. He didn't wear it. Instead, he held it out to the mirror, and the reflection took it. The glass rippled. The moment the mask passed through, Elliot's surroundings began to dissolve. Not like waking from a dream, but like returning to one. Portraits faded, names vanished. Even the hallway began to unravel, turning to light, memory, wind. The reflection changed. Not into another version of Elliot, but into all of them. 1,000 faces, one by one, layered atop each other, morphing, merging, until finally only one face remained. His. The one that had always been underneath. Tears spilled freely. He whispered, "I see you now." And the reflection smiled, not with menace, not with mystery, but with peace. The hallway reassembled itself. The mirror stilled. Elliot stood alone, but this time fully himself. The mask, the voices, the names, they weren't burdens. They were parts. And at last they had come together. Chapter 14. One truth, one face. The house had quieted, as if holding its breath. Elliot stood in his study, the final mask gone, the mirror stilled. All the portraits, once vibrant and humming with memory, now rested with calm finality. No more flickers, no whispers. The eye with 3 lashes, the symbol that had followed him through every step, seemed to glow gently from the walls, not as a warning, but as a seal. He walked through each room like a man visiting versions of himself. The hallway where he once doubted, the kitchen where he first saw strangers in the mirror. The attic, now dim and warm, still held echoes, but not of confusion, of clarity. In the corner sat a final canvas, blank. Elliot approached it with a brush in hand. He dipped into no paint, yet colors bled from the bristles as he painted. His strokes were steady. He painted not a face, but a landscape, a river, a fire, a child. 1,000 layered memories, not as burdens, but as pieces of a mosaic. Each brush stroke felt like release. The images that emerged were not literal, but emotional, a stream of time stitched together with the colors of memory. As he painted, he whispered names he had once forgotten, now returning to him like long-lost friends. He laughed softly at some, cried at others. When he stepped back, the painting pulsed with life. It was not about who he had been, but what he had carried, what he had healed. He sat down, exhausted but peaceful. Then a knock. At the door stood a young boy, eyes wide, holding a mask. Elliot smiled. "Are you ready to remember?" he asked. The boy nodded. Elliot stepped aside, welcoming him in. The boy walked slowly, as if already sensing the weight of the space. His gaze wandered to the mirrors, the empty frames, and finally to the painting. He gasped. "It's all of it," he said quietly. Elliot nodded. "Yes, all of it." The boy looked down at the mask. "Do I have to wear it?" "No," Elliot replied. "Not unless it helps you find your truth." They stood in silence for a long while, two souls on either end of a legacy, but neither above the other. And for the first time in his many lives, Elliot didn't feel alone. The face he wore now wasn't borrowed. It was his. Chapter 15. The Man Who Became Everyone. The boy sat across from Elliot, eyes filled with silent questions. In his hands he held the mask gently, almost reverently. Elliot offered him tea, not because it was needed, but because hospitality grounded them both in something real, something now. They sat together in the quiet room where portraits once spoke, where candles once danced, and slowly Elliot began to speak, not in riddles, not in the ancient tones of his former voices, but as himself. The only self that mattered now. He told the boy about the mirror that smiled, about the attic full of memories that wore faces, about a voice that was once his, then wasn't, about masks that changed people, about names that didn't stay, and a legacy not chosen but inherited. The boy listened. He didn't interrupt. Didn't ask, but Elliot could see recognition forming behind his eyes, shadows of understanding that hadn't yet found words. When Elliot finished, he rose and brought the boy to the canvas, the painting of the river, the fire, the mosaic of memory. "This," he said, "is all of them. But none of them are me, not anymore. I remember them, I honor them, but I don't have to carry them alone." The boy looked up. "Then what happens now?" Elliot smiled. "Now, you begin your own story." He placed a hand over the boy's heart. "You're not here to become me. You're here to become you." The boy looked down at the mask in his hands, then slowly turned toward the front door. It opened on its own. Beyond it, a path. Not the winding corridors of memory, not the echoes of the past, but a true beginning. Elliot watched him go, knowing the boy would return when he was ready, not to repeat the past, but to understand it. And as the door closed, Elliot turned to the mirror. His face for the first time showed only one truth, his own. The man who had worn 1,000 faces had finally become himself.